The King and the Chariot. You've seen the image thousands of times, the serene face, the wavy hair, the draped robes in classical folds, the Buddha, as most of us picture him. What you may not know is that for nearly 5 centuries after his death, the Buddha was never depicted in human form at all, until Greek sculptors brought their classical conventions to the workshops of ancient Afghanistan. Workshops shaped by the cultural world Alexander's conquests had created around 150 BCE in the city of Sagala, in what is now Pakistan. A Greek king met a Buddhist monk. The king asked, "What is your name?" The monk answered, "I am called Nagasena, but Nagasena is only a name. There is no permanent self to be found." The king replied, "Then who am I talking to?" Tonight, the Chariot at the center of that dialogue. The objections a Greek king pressed 3 times, and the answer the Buddhist canon offers in reply, an answer this tradition has never improved upon. Chapter 1. Before we go to Sagala, let me show you what's strange about the image you carry. For almost 5 centuries after the Buddha's death, no one in the Buddhist tradition made an image of him. There are stone railings from the great stupas of Chariot and Sanchi, carved with elaborate narrative scenes. The Buddha's birth, his enlightenment, his teaching, his death. And in these scenes, where the Buddha himself should be, the artist left a sign. Sometimes a pair of footprints, sometimes an empty throne under a tree, sometimes a wheel, the Dhamma wheel, Dhammacakka, the wheel of teaching set in motion, sometimes a parasol held above empty space. The Buddha was present in the scene by means of these symbols. His body, his face, never shown. Why? Scholars have debated this for over a century. Some have argued that the early tradition observed a doctrinal prohibition, that to depict the Buddha in human form was somehow to misrepresent the awakened state. Others see no prohibition at all, only a different visual language, a tradition that preferred to indicate presence through sign and symbol rather than likeness. We do not have the early Buddhist sculptors on record explaining their choice. What we know is that the choice held for roughly 500 years, and then, in the 1st century of the Common Era, in 2 different regions of the subcontinent, almost at the same time, that choice was broken. The Buddha began to appear in human form. One of those regions was Mathura, in the heart of northern India, where indigenous sculptors developed their own conception. A powerful, rounded, robust Buddha, drawing on older Yaksa traditions. The other region was Gandhara, the ancient name for the country lying across what is now northern Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan. And in Gandhara, the sculptors worked in a different visual language entirely. They gave the Buddha wavy hair, gathered up in the manner of a Greek god. They draped him in robes that fall in the classical folds of a Roman toga. They gave him the features and the proportions of Hellenistic statuary. This was the Buddha as seen through Greek eyes. Both schools rose at roughly the same moment. Which came first remains debated. But of the 2, it was the Gandharan type, the Greek-influenced one, that spread most widely across Buddhist Asia. The image that most of us picture when we think of the Buddha is, in its bones, a Greek inheritance. And the question for tonight is, how did that come to be? The short answer is Alexander. In 327 BCE, the Macedonian king crossed the Hindu Kush and pushed his army as far east as the Beas River, in what is now the Indian Punjab. His soldiers refused to go further. He turned back. He died in Babylon 4 years later, at the age of 32. But the Eastern Empire he had built did not collapse with him. His generals divided his territories among themselves, and from one of those divisions, the Seleucid East, there eventually emerged a string of independent Greek kingdoms in the regions of Bactria and the Upper Indus. We call them the Indo-Greek kingdoms. They were founded by generations of Greek-speaking dynasts who had never seen Macedonia, and they ruled, in places, for nearly 2 centuries. These were not garrisons or occupations. They were cities. They had gymnasiums, theatres, libraries. They minted beautiful coins. Their inscriptions appeared in both Greek and the local Indian scripts. And they were ruled by men trained in the paideia, the classical education of Greek antiquity, which meant Homer and Plato, and the disciplines of philosophy and rhetoric. In Gandhara, by the 2nd century BCE, a Greek-speaking elite was living alongside an Indian-speaking elite that included Buddhist monastic communities of long standing. The two traditions had already been in conversation for generations. The greatest of these Indo-Greek kings reigned from approximately 165 to 130 BCE. His name was Menander. The Indian sources call him Milinda. What we know of Menander from outside the Buddhist tradition is this: his coins are the most numerous of any Indo-Greek ruler. They have been found across an enormous geographic range, from Bactria to the Ganges Valley. He took the Greek epithet sota, saviour, the same word Greek-speaking Christians would later use of Christ. His capital was at Sagala, a city most scholars now identify with the modern town of Sialkot in the Pakistani Punjab. There is a single bronze coin of his, preserved in the British Museum, that bears the image of an 8-spoked wheel. Some scholars see in that wheel a deliberate reference to the Dhammacakka, the Buddhist wheel of teaching. Others point out that the wheel was a pan-Indian royal symbol with no necessary Buddhist content, and that one coin in a vast corpus is thin evidence. The interpretation is contested. There is also a small reliquary, found in 1836 near a place called Shinkot, in the Bajor district of present-day Pakistan, that bears an inscription. The inscription records that Buddhist relics were enshrined there in the reign of Maharaja Menander. This proves something important, but only what it proves: that Buddhist relic enshrinement was taking place under his sovereignty. It does not tell us what Menander himself believed. And then there is one further piece of evidence from outside the Buddhist sources. A remarkable passage in the Greek biographer Plutarch, writing 2 centuries after Menander's death. Plutarch records that when Menander died on campaign, the cities of his kingdom disputed possession of his ashes and finally divided them equally among themselves so that each city might raise a monument to him. Modern scholars have observed how strikingly that story resembles the Buddhist tradition concerning the Buddha's own relics, which were similarly divided among the kingdoms of North India after his death. Plutarch himself never makes that comparison. He almost certainly did not know it. But the parallel has not escaped notice, so we cannot know in any final sense what Menander believed when he died. The later Buddhist tradition holds that he became a lay disciple. The coins are ambiguous. The reliquary tells us only that he ruled in a Buddhist land. What we do know is this: in the region he ruled, 2 great traditions, Greek philosophy and Buddhist teaching, were in genuine and sustained conversation, and one record of that conversation has survived. That record is the milindapanha, the questions of King Milinda. And before we open it, we need to be honest about what kind of text it is. The milindapanha is not part of the Buddha's recorded teaching. It belongs to a category that scholars sometimes call para-canonical. It was composed perhaps in the 1st century BCE, possibly in the region we have just been describing. in a literary Indian language and later transmitted in Pali. In Burma, in the Buddhist tradition of what is now Myanmar, it is accepted as canonical, included as the 18th book of the Khuddaka Nikaya. In Thailand and in Sri Lanka, it is not. Encyclopaedia Britannica describes it accurately as the one non-canonical work whose authority was accepted implicitly by the great commentators of the tradition. Buddhaghosa quotes it. The tradition holds it in extraordinary esteem, but it does not have the same standing as the suttas spoken by the Buddha himself. For our purposes tonight, this matters in a specific way. We are going to need to keep three sources of authority distinct as we go. The first is the canonical teaching, the suttas of the 5 Nikayas, the Buddha's recorded words. The second is the milindapanha itself, para-canonical, immensely respected, the source of the dialogue we are about to enter. The third is later commentarial development, the formal philosophical apparatus of Buddhist scholasticism, which builds on both the suttas and the milindapanha. As we go, I'll signal which one we are in. Multiple English translations exist. The standard 19th century translation is by T.W. Rhys-Davids, published in the Sacred Books of the East series in the 1890s. Archaic now, but authoritative, and freely available online. The most accessible modern abridgment is by Bhikkhu Pasala, drawn from Rhys-Davids. The complete scholarly translation in the Pali Text Society series is by I.B. Horner. And in 2025, Maria Heim published a new full scholarly translation in the Murty Classical Library at Harvard. The passages we will draw on tonight are verifiable in all of them. What the text gives us is this. A monk named Nagasena, said to have been raised in a Brahmin family in the foothills of the Himalayas, trained from his youth in the Vedic sciences, and converted as a young man to Buddhism, comes south to Sagala. The text frames him as a great philosophical adept, and like much in the Milindapanha's frame story, that framing carries the marks of religious literature. The hero is foretold, the encounter is destined. We can take that framing for what it is. What matters is what happens when Nagasena sits down across from the king. The king has questions. They are not the polite questions of court ceremony. They are the questions of a man trained in Greek dialectic, who has read Plato perhaps, who knows how to press an argument until something gives. He has spent years in the company of Buddhist teachers. The text lists them by name. He has not been satisfied. He has, in particular, one question that no one has answered to his satisfaction. It is the question that goes to the heart of what the Buddhist tradition teaches about the human self. And he is about to put it, for the first time, to a monk who can answer. The opening exchange is 3 sentences long. We turn to it now. Chapter 2. The king takes his seat. The monk takes his. The king begins. What is your name, sir? The monk says, I am called Nagasena, great king. My fellow monks address me as Nagasena. But Nagasena is only a designation in common use, a generally understood term. There is no permanent individuality involved in the matter. The king pauses. He has heard Buddhist teachers say something like this before. He has not been pressed satisfactorily on what it means. Now, with this monk in front of him, he presses. If that is so, the king says, then I have several questions. Who is it who gives gifts? Who is it who undertakes the holy life? Who is it who attains the fruits of the path? Who, if there is no Nagasena, can be said to have done good or evil? And tell me this, if I were to strike you down where you sit, no one would be killed. There would be no murderer and no victim. Is that what you are saying? This is the philosophical pressure point. It is the same objection that has been pressed against the Buddhist teaching on no self ever since the Buddha first taught it. Pressed by Brahmins, pressed by Jains, pressed by every philosophical school in North India. If there is no self, who acts? If no one acts, what is morality? If no one is reborn, what is karma? If no one attains liberation, what is the path? And the king is correct to press it. The objection has force. A teaching that cannot answer it has not been thought through. Nagasena does not answer directly. He turns the question. Great king, how did you come here today? On foot or by some conveyance? By chariot, venerable sir. Then if you have come by chariot, great king, show me the chariot. Tell me, is the pole the chariot? No, sir. Is the axle the chariot? No. The wheels? Are the wheels the chariot? No. The framework then, the ropes, the yoke, the spokes, the goad. To each of these, no. Then is it the combination of pole and axle and wheels and framework and ropes and yoke and spokes and goad? Is that the chariot? No, venerable sir. Then is it something outside of these, something other than pole, axle, wheels, framework, ropes, yoke, spokes, and goad? That is the chariot. No, sir, there is nothing else. Then, great king, though I question you closely, I find no chariot. Chariot is only a sound. Where is the chariot? The king, by his own admission, is caught. He laughs. He acknowledges that he has been answered with his own method. And then he says, the text records this exactly, that it is on account of its having all these things, the pole and the axle and the wheels and the framework and the ropes and the yoke and the spokes and the goad, that it comes under the generally understood term, the designation in common use, the name chariot. Well done, great king, Nagasena says. You have correctly understood. And in the same way, on account of the 32 parts of the body and the 5 aggregates of grasping, I come under the generally understood term, the designation in common use, the name Nagasena. And here is the point I want to mark. This argument is not Nagasena's invention. He says so himself. In the next breath, he quotes a canonical source. He says, this is what was spoken by the nun Vajira in the presence of the Blessed One. The nun Vajira appears in a single sutta in the canon, Samyutta Nikaya 5.10, S. N. 5.10. She is a Buddhist nun, alone in a grove for meditation, when Mara, the figure of temptation and obstruction in Buddhist literature, approaches her and tries to unsettle her with a metaphysical question. By whom was this being created? Who is the maker of this being? Where does this being come from? Where will it go? And Vajira answers, in verse, just as, with an assemblage of parts, the word chariot is used. Even so, when the aggregates are present, there is the convention being, a single verse, spoken by a nun, to Mara, in the Buddha's own time and within the canon itself. This is where the chariot argument comes from. The Milindapanha picks it up 2 centuries later and unfolds it into a full philosophical exchange with a Greek king. But the seed is canonical, and the voice that planted it is a woman's. I want to underline this, because the tradition does not always foreground it. The most famous philosophical argument in Buddhism for the dependent and constructed nature of the self, the chariot, has a female canonical source. Nagasena's elegance is in unfolding her insight. The insight itself is hers. So then, the chariot dissolves the surface question. Nagasena exists in the way a chariot exists, as a useful designation for a combination of parts and conditions. He is not asserting that Nagasena does not exist. He is asserting something more careful, that Nagasena is a name we apply to a combination, in the way Chariot is a name we apply to a combination. The convention is real. The convention is functional. But ultimate analysis finds no further entity behind the convention. The king is satisfied with the elegance of the answer. He says, well done, Nagasena." But he is not satisfied with all of its consequences, and he now begins, methodically, to press the consequences. There are three. The first is rebirth. If there is no permanent self, the king says, who is reborn? When this Nagasena dies and another comes to be, what is the relation between them? If there is no continuity of self, then it must be a different person who is reborn. But if it is a different person, then it is not the rebirth of me. Who then is reborn? Nagasena answers with an image. Suppose a man, great king, were to light one lamp from another lamp. Can it be said that the one lamp transmigrates from, or to, the other? The king sees the point. The second lamp is not the first, but neither is the second lamp wholly unrelated to the first. It owes its light to the first. Something is past. Something is also not past. There is continuity without identity. Nagasena offers a second image. Milk turns to curds. The curds become butter. The butter is refined into ghee. At what point is the milk the same as the ghee? At no point. But neither is the ghee unrelated to the milk. The ghee arose from the milk by a series of transformations, each conditioned by the last. It is neither the same as the milk nor wholly other than it. The condition process continues. The king understands. It does not require a permanent substrate to continue. It requires only the lawfulness of cause and effect. The second objection follows. If there is no permanent self, the king says, who is responsible for moral action? If the person who commits a crime is not, in any final sense, the same person who later faces its consequences, then how can there be moral responsibility at all? Nagasena answers, again, with images. Suppose a man steals mangoes from another man's orchard. The mangoes that were stolen are not, strictly speaking, the same mangoes that the original owner planted. Those have ripened, fallen, and been replaced by new fruit on the same trees. Could the thief defend himself by saying, "These mangoes are not the ones you planted, therefore I owe you nothing"? He could not. The conventional identity of the orchard and of the man who tends it is sufficient to ground the moral relation. Or, a man lights a fire in a field. He leaves it burning. The fire spreads to a neighboring field and destroys the harvest. Could he defend himself by saying, "The fire that spread is not the same fire I lit"? He could not. The continuity of the causal chain is sufficient. Moral responsibility, in other words, does not require a metaphysically permanent self. It requires only that there be sufficient causal continuity between the agent of an action and the one who later faces its consequences. The conventional identity of a person, sustained moment to moment through a chain of conditioned processes, is sufficient ground for responsibility. The Buddhist teaching on no self does not dissolve morality. It clarifies what morality has always actually rested on. The third objection is the deepest, and the king does not press it as a separate episode. It is folded into his original challenge and answered through the chariot itself. If there is no self, who undertakes the holy life? Who walks the path? Who attains the cessation of suffering? And the answer is the same answer the chariot has already given. The path is walked by the conventional person, by the combination of conditioned factors to which the name Nagasena refers. That conventional person is fully real, at the conventional level. The practice he undertakes is fully real. the cessation he attains is fully real. What ultimate analysis denies is not the practice, but the existence of a permanent metaphysical entity behind the practice. The practice does not require such an entity. It only requires that the process continue. And here is where I want to introduce a phrase that the later tradition will lift out of these exchanges and turn into a formal doctrine, though I want to be careful about how I introduce it. What the milindapanha demonstrates, and what later Buddhist philosophy will systematize, is sometimes called the doctrine of the two truths, the conventional truth, samuttisaka, and the ultimate truth, paramattasaka. At the conventional level, persons exist, chariots exist, actions have agents, karma has subjects. At the ultimate level, analysis finds only processes and conditions, no permanent person, no permanent chariot, no permanent agent. Both levels are simultaneously true, but I want to be careful here, because I owe you accuracy on what comes from where. The formal pair samuttisaka and paramattasaka is not found as a developed doctrine in the five Nikayas. It is an abhidharmic and commentarial elaboration, the later philosophical apparatus of Buddhist scholasticism, articulated systematically by Buddhaghosa and others in the centuries after the Milindapanha itself. What the Milindapanha does is show the intuition in action before the formal doctrine has been named. And so we have, in this single chapter of dialogue, three layers of authority operating at once. The chariot itself, taken from the nun Vajira in the canon, the unfolding of the chariot into a philosophical dialogue, para-canonical in the Milindapanha, and the formal two truths framework that later commentators will derive from both, commentarial, 3 layers, 1 teaching. And the teaching is this: the self you take yourself to be is real in the way a chariot is real. It is a useful designation for a combination of causes and conditions. There is no permanent entity behind the designation, and nothing about the path of practice, or the workings of karma, or the reality of moral life requires such an entity. The Greek king has been answered, but the answer reaches deeper than he has yet pressed. We turn now to the canon itself, to what the Buddha had said in his own voice about the very question Milinda has just asked. Chapter 3. The Milindapanha is a remarkable text, but it is, as I've said, para-canonical. Nagasena is doing brilliant philosophical work in the dialogue with Milinda, but he is doing it in a literary form composed perhaps 2 centuries after the Buddha. So a fair question to ask now is this: what did the Buddha himself, in the suttas of the canon, actually teach about the self? And how does what we have heard from Nagasena compare? I want to walk through 3 canonical passages, briefly, because they show the depth that the Milindapanha dialogue rests on. The first is the Anatta Sutta, the discourse on the mark of non-self. Samyutta Nikaya 22.59, SN 22.59. The tradition records it as the Buddha's second sermon, delivered to his first 5 disciples shortly after his enlightenment, a few weeks after the famous first sermon at Sarnath. In it, the Buddha takes the human being apart into 5 categories. The so-called 5 aggregates: form or material body, feeling, perception, mental fabrications, and consciousness. He then examines each one in turn. His argument has a precise form. If form were truly the self, he says, if it were what you most fundamentally are, then form would obey you. You would be able to say to it, "Let my form be thus, let my form not be thus." But you cannot. The body sickens, ages, suffers, dies against your will. The same with feeling. Feeling cannot be commanded. The same with perception, with the mental fabrications, with consciousness. Each of these is impermanent. Each is bound up with suffering. Each, therefore, is unfit to be regarded as, this is mine, this is what I am, this is myself. Notice what the Buddha does not say. He does not say there is no self. He says these five aggregates are not the self. That distinction matters. He is dismantling a particular kind of identification, the identification of the self with body, feelings, perceptions, mental contents, awareness. He is not making the metaphysical claim that nothing whatsoever exists where a self might be looked for. That is a different claim, and the Buddha is conspicuously careful not to make it. How careful? Consider the second passage, the Ananda Sutta, Samyutta Nikaya, 44.10, S.N. 44.10. A wanderer named Vajira, who appears repeatedly in the canon as a philosophical questioner, comes to the Buddha and asks two questions, one after the other. Master Gautama, is there a self? The Buddha is silent. Master Gautama, is there no self? Again, the Buddha is silent. Vajira leaves dissatisfied. Ananda, the Buddha's closest disciple, asks him afterward, "Why did you not answer?" The Buddha explains, "If I had said there is a self, I would have been siding with the philosophical schools that teach an eternal, unchanging soul, the position Buddhist tradition calls eternalism. If I had said there is no self, I would have been siding with the philosophers who teach that consciousness simply ceases at death, leaving nothing behind, the position called annihilationism. Both, in the Buddha's analysis, are wrong views, and worse, had I said there is no self to Vajira, in his current state of confusion, he would have heard it as nihilism. He would have walked away thinking the Buddha had told him that he himself does not exist, that nothing matters, that his moral life is meaningless. That is not the teaching. So the Buddha was silent. This is the central canonical text on the question of the self, and it is genuinely difficult to interpret. The contemporary American monastic Thanissaro Bhikkhu reads this sutta and others alongside it as evidence that the not-self teaching is, in his phrase, a strategy of attention rather than a metaphysical thesis, a method for letting go of identification, not a claim that no self exists. The Sri Lankan trained scholar-monk Bhikkhu Bodhi reads it differently. In his notes to this very sutta, he disagrees with Thanissaro's reading explicitly, arguing that the deep teaching of the Buddha is indeed that there is no self in any ultimate sense, but that the Buddha refused to say this to Vajira because Vajira would have misunderstood it. I am not going to adjudicate between these two readings tonight. Both are careful scholars working from the same canonical text. What I want you to notice is something both readings agree on. The Buddha refused the binary. Asked, "Is there a self? Is there no self?" He would not answer either way. There is something about the question that, in the form it is being asked, is the wrong question. The third passage makes that explicit. The Sabbasava Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 2, M.N. 2. The Buddha describes what he calls inappropriate attention, the kinds of questions an untrained mind asks that lead, he says, to a thicket of views, a wilderness of views, a fetter of views. And the questions he lists are striking. Was I in the past? Was I not in the past? What was I in the past? How was I in the past? Will I be in the future? Will I not be? What will I be? Am I? Am I not? What am I? How am I? These, the Buddha says, are wrong questions, and the view that arises from them, whether the view is I have a self, or in Thanisaro's reading of this passage, the view "I have no self" is one of the views the Buddha is warning against. Even the apparently sober metaphysical conclusion "I have no self" is, on this reading, a wrong view, because it is an answer to a wrong question. So put these three canonical passages together. In the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, the Buddha dismantles 5 candidates for what the self might be, and finds none of them fit. In the Ananda Sutta, asked directly whether a self exists or not, he refuses both answers. In the Sabbasava Sutta, he warns that the very framework of the question, "What am I fundamentally?" leads the mind into a thicket. And now look back at what Nagasena did. He did not say Nagasena does not exist. He did not say Nagasena exists eternally. He said Nagasena is a useful designation for a combination of things. He showed, with the Chariot, that the right relationship to the question of personal identity is to see it as a question about conventional designation, useful, functional, real at its level, without taking the designation to refer to a permanent metaphysical entity. This is what the canon does. This is the Buddhist middle way on the question of the self. Not self exists, not self does not exist. Both are extremes. The middle position is, there is a conditioned process, lawful and continuous, to which the conventional name person applies. Ultimate analysis finds no permanent entity behind the name. Both levels are simultaneously true. Nagasena, in other words, is doing exactly what the canon does. He is refusing the binary the king has tried to force him into. And here, I want to step back and acknowledge something about the broader intellectual world in which this conversation took place. The Indo-Greek encounter was not one-directional. We have spent most of this evening on the question of how a Greek king came to engage with Buddhist teaching. But the traffic ran the other way as well. There is a Greek philosopher named Pyrrho of Elis, who lived from roughly 360 to 270 BCE, a generation or so after the Buddha and a century before Menander. Pyrrho is recorded by the ancient biographer Diogenes Laertius as having travelled to India in the entourage of Alexander the Great. He met Indian philosophers, the gymnosophists, the naked sages, as the Greeks called them. And when he returned to Greece, he founded a distinctive school of skeptical philosophy, whose central practice was the suspension of judgment about metaphysical questions, and whose central aim was a state of tranquility achieved by ceasing to grasp at fixed views. In 2015, the historian Christopher Beckwith published a book arguing that Pyrrho's encounter with Indian philosophers, possibly Buddhists, possibly proto-Buddhists, directly shaped his skeptical method. The argument is contested. It is not the scholarly consensus, but it is taken seriously. And what is not contested is the broader fact. By the 2nd century BCE, when Menander sat down with Nagasena, the intellectual milieu of the Hellenistic East had been shaped for generations by exactly this kind of exchange. That matters for how we read what happens between the king and the monk. Menander was not a Buddhist hearing Buddhist teaching for the first time. He was a Greek-trained philosophical mind in a cultural world where Greek and Indian philosophy had already been in conversation for generations. And the question he was pressing Nagasena on, what is a person fundamentally, was one his own tradition had been answering with great philosophical seriousness for centuries. 3 answers in particular would have been available to him. The oldest came from Plato. In the Phaedo, written in the early 4th century BCE, Plato has Socrates argue, in his last hours before drinking the hemlock, that the soul is immortal, simple, indivisible, immaterial, existing before birth and surviving after death. The soul is the true person. The body is its temporary habitation. What you are, fundamentally, is a permanent, persisting psychic entity that pre-existed this lifetime and will outlive it. The argument from recollection that we can recognize geometric truths we were never taught because the soul knew them in a prior existence was a foundational text of Greek philosophical training. Any educated Greek of Menander's class would have known it, and it gave a clear, confident answer to the king's question. There is a permanent self. It is the soul, and it survives. The second answer came from Aristotle, Plato's student, writing later in the same century. Aristotle was more skeptical of his teacher's psychic dualism. In On the Soul, he argued that the soul is not a separate substance inhabiting a body, but rather the form of a body, the principle of organization, life, and function that makes a living being what it is. The soul is to the body as the act of seeing is to the eye, not separable, not a thing alongside the organ, but the very actualization of its capacities. This is a subtler, more biologically grounded view than Plato's, but it still presupposes that there is a real, substantial human form, a what it is to be a person, that grounds personal identity. The form persists across change. You are not a permanent simple soul, but you are a permanent kind of being, structured around an essence. The third answer came from the Stoics, whose school was, by Menander's lifetime, the most influential philosophical movement in the Hellenistic world. Stoic teaching held that the entire cosmos was pervaded by divine reason, logos, and that each individual person was a fragment of that universal reason, a spark of cosmic mind temporarily individuated in a human body. At the center of every person was the hegemonikon, the ruling rational principle, which Stoic ethics taught one should bring into harmony with the cosmic order. This was a richer, more participatory account than Plato's lonely immortal soul. You are not isolated, you are a part of something larger. But the center of personhood, the rational governing principle, is still treated as real, substantial, the locus of who you fundamentally are. These three positions, and others within Greek thought, agreed on something important. They agreed that there is something real and substantial at the center of the person, something that grounds personal identity through change, something that the question, "What am I?" picks out as its answer. They disagreed about what that something was: an immortal soul, a substantial form, a fragment of cosmic reason. They agreed that something was there, and what Menander found when he pressed Nagasena was something else entirely, a position that had not been formulated within Greek philosophy at all, not the eternal soul of the Phaedo, not the substantial form of Aristotle, not the divine spark of the Stoics, something more careful, a refusal to assert any permanent entity at all, combined with a rigorous account of the person as a conditioned process, real at its conventional level, dissolvable under analysis, requiring no permanent center to do any of the work that personhood actually does in moral and practical life. Karma works, rebirth works, the path works, liberation works, all without a permanent self at the center. This was not a position one could place inside Plato, or inside Aristotle, or inside the Stoa. It was a fourth option, one his own tradition had not arrived at on its own, and Menander, by his own response, recognized that he was hearing something genuinely new, and Menander said, well done, Nagasena. That is the philosophical depth of the Chariot. It is what the Chariot stands on, and it is what was being recognized across the cultural distance that separated Sagala from Athens. We are nearly at the close. Before we end, I want to return to where we began. to the image of the Buddha that emerged, a century or two later, from the workshops of this same region. Because the chariot and the image are connected, and the connection is the thing this video has been moving toward. Close. A few centuries after Milinda and Nagasena sat together in Sagala, the artists of Gandhara began to do what no Buddhist artist before them had done. They began to depict the Buddha in human form. The workshops were in the same cultural world that had produced the dialogue. The Hellenistic east of the Upper Indus, where Greek and Indian visual conventions had been in conversation for generations. The sculptors knew Greek statuary. They knew how a Greek god was rendered. They applied those conventions to the Buddha. They gave him wavy hair, gathered up in the manner of Apollo. They draped him in robes that fall in classical folds. They gave him serene, idealized features and a perfect proportion. They made him beautiful in the way Greek art had taught them to make a divine figure beautiful. In Mathura, at almost the same moment, a different tradition was doing the same thing with different conventions. The Mathura Buddha was rounder, more frontal, more rooted in indigenous Indian artistic forms. Both schools rose at the same cultural turn. Both produced what no earlier Buddhist art had produced. A Buddha with a body, a face, a posture, a gaze, but it was the Gandharan type that traveled. It moved north along the Silk Road into Central Asia. It moved east into China, and from China into Korea, and from Korea into Japan. The serene, half-lidded gaze you have seen 10,000 times in photographs and museum vitrines and bronze figurines on bookshelves. That gaze is a Gandharan inheritance. The Buddha you carry in your mind, in some real sense, is a Buddha that came back to you from a Greek encounter, and the chariot is the same kind of inheritance. The argument made by a nun named Vajira in a single sutta in the Buddhist canon unfolded 2 centuries later into a full philosophical exchange between a Greek king and a Buddhist monk in a city that no longer exists. Recorded in a text accepted as canonical by some Buddhist traditions and not others. Quoted by Buddhaghosa. Translated into Greek and Latin and English. Still being taught in monasteries from Burma to Vermont 2,000 years later. The chariot is also an inheritance from this same cultural turn. What happened to Menander, the man at the center of the dialogue, we cannot know in any final sense. The Buddhist tradition holds that he became a lay disciple of Nagasena. His coins continue to bear his Greek royal titles with the symbols of Greek kingship, not Buddhist iconography. The single wheel coin in the British Museum may or may not be a Dhammacakka. The Shinkot reliquary tells us only that Buddhist relic enshrinement happened in his kingdom. Plutarch tells us the cities of his realm divided his ashes, a story that resembles the Buddhist tradition of the Buddha's relics. But Plutarch never makes that comparison, and we cannot read his mind through it. What we have in the end is not Menander's personal faith. What we have is the dialogue itself, the questions a Greek king asked, the answers a Buddhist monk gave, and the careful philosophical work both of them did together. That dialogue is what survives. That is what was worth preserving, what the tradition cared enough about to copy and translate and quote across 2 millennia. Not the man's conversion, the exchange of minds, and what the exchange of minds produced. The part that has not aged, the part that is still doing philosophical work, is the chariot. Look at what the chariot accomplishes, pressed by a king with a sharp objection. If there is no self who acts, who is reborn, who is responsible, who walks the path, Nagasena does not retreat into mysticism. He does not say the question is too deep for words. He does not invoke a higher authority. He answers philosophically, in the king's own register, with an example the king himself supplies. He shows that the king's question rested on a hidden assumption, that for a person to be real, a permanent entity must exist behind the name. He dismantles that assumption with a chariot. He shows that conventional designations are real and functional precisely because they refer to lawful combinations of causes and conditions, not because they refer to permanent entities. The chariot is real. Chariot is also only a word. Both are true, and what holds for the chariot holds. The canon and the dialogue agree. For the person who is hearing this, what you are is real. Your life, your relationships, your moral responsibilities, your practice, your suffering, your striving towards something better. All of this is real at the level at which any of it matters. None of it is denied by the Buddhist teaching on no self. None of it has to be defended against the teaching. What the teaching invites you to notice is that the kind of reality you are is not the kind you may have assumed. You are not a permanent thing carrying a name. You are a lawful, conditioned, continuously changing process to which a name has been usefully applied. Like a chariot, like one lamp lit from another, like milk becoming ghee, real, continuous, without anything inside it that does not change. 21 centuries ago, in a city in what is now Pakistan, a Greek king sat down with a Buddhist monk. The king asked, "What is your name?" The monk answered carefully, quoting a nun who had answered it first. "I am called Nagasena," he said, "but Nagasena is only a name. There is no permanent individuality involved in the matter. As a chariot is a word for an assemblage of parts, so Nagasena is a word for an assemblage of factors." The king listened. He pressed the consequences. He found the answers careful enough to satisfy his philosophical training. And he said finally, well done, Nagasena." The text ends. The kingdom passes. The workshops close. The image of the Buddha travels. The argument remains. And the chariot is still here. The same as it was for Vajira in the grove. The same as it was for Nagasena in Sagala. The same as it is for you tonight.